Hey, what's up? It's Mark at Alchemist.camp, where usually we learn Elixir and the Phoenix framework by building things, but today I'm going to answer a subscriber question. That question is, how does Laravel compare to the Phoenix framework? And you may remember way back when, during my very first episode, the welcome episode for Alchemist Camp, you can see it at alchemist.camp/episode/welcome, I presented a chart with a number of different languages, including PHP, or a number of different backends, I should say, because I included Rails, even though it's not a language, it's Ruby on Rails. On this chart, I examined a few different dimensions. One was solo developer speed, another was performance as a web server, another was number crunching performance, then how difficult or easy it is to debug apps with it as they get larger, and what the concurrency story is, and then finally whether or not it has any features for fault tolerance, which incidentally nothing on here except for Elixir does. It gets all of that from the Erlang virtual machine. If you're a solo developer or you're a startup, probably the most important line on this chart is solo dev productivity, which is probably why Rails is so popular for startups and not so popular for huge companies unless they've just kept Rails the entire time, like say GitHub and Stripe and a few companies like that have. With just PHP, you're going to be considerably less productive than you would be with Rails or Elixir and Phoenix or pretty much any MVC framework. However, with Laravel, you'll get the same sorts of migrations and generators that you do get with Rails and Phoenix and say like Scala Play framework and any of the other popular MVCs. And it's going to make you a lot more productive than just PHP on its own. In my experience, it'll come out to be about the same productivity as Elixir and Phoenix, depending on what your project is. So there are some obvious advantages in terms of just ecosystem size with PHP in general. Laravel itself is very popular. It's hasn't been around quite as long as Rails, but it has a very Rails-like ecosystem of people contributing to it. And you can find a lot of libraries to do what you need done without you having to write it all yourself. On the minus side, it's not quite as high level of a language. So, for example, you don't have anything like macros or protocols. That makes it harder to make a good DSL. So you'll actually still be writing more code to do the same amount of work, a bit more than Phoenix, considerably more than with Rails. And the other thing that will speed up development of a Phoenix app as your app gets larger is the fact that debugging is extremely easy because everything is immutable. There's just a large case of situations where you'll have shared state on some object and it will make things difficult to understand unless you know the app inside and out. And that's not specific to Laravel. I've seen the same thing happen with Rails and JavaScript projects and pretty much anything where your data is mutable. The server performance question is also a fairly interesting trade-off. In terms of anything that's evented or real-time, like say you're making a chat system, Phoenix will have a significant advantage. There's a pretty famous test from 4 years ago, which time both Elixir and Phoenix were less performant than they are now, where the creator of the Phoenix framework demoed a chat room with 2 million people connected to it that was run off of a single server. It was a pretty bare bones sort of chat room, but that's still pretty amazing. And the PHP model involves basically firing everything up to handle each individual request instead of keeping a server running with things stored in memory. And it'll do much worse for that sort of thing. For a basic CRUD app, it might actually perform a bit better. For anything with number crunching, it may be a bit better, or it may be about the same, but have an easier time interfacing with C. Because with Elixir, you can interface with C, but you have to be very, very careful about using what's called a natively invoked function, because if there's anything in it that crashes, it can take down the entire Erlang virtual machine, which is a big deal for Elixir because one of its main selling points is its fault tolerance. And fault tolerance comes from the VM, whereas with PHP, that's not really a big deal. You'll just get an error on one given request, and then you start everything up again on the next request anyway. My experience debugging PHP can be kind of a rough experience, not as bad as it used to be, probably not as bad as JavaScript can be because of all the anonymous functions and just really bad stack traces you see in the node world. It's not concurrent, so just like Rails or just like Django, if you want to, if you do want to have like a chat server or something like that, you're probably going to be interfacing with Redis or something similar. So all in all, I think it depends a lot on what kind of project you've got. If you've got a fairly traditional CRUD web app, maybe PHP Laravel is the way to go. If you're building something that's highly interactive, like say a chat app or a game server or something related to real-time mapping, then there are definitely advantages in checking out Elixir. There's one last thing I wanted to share with everyone, and that was a pretty interesting paper I read a couple years ago called Software Economics and Function Point Metrics. It's basically a survey of the economic productivity of different programming languages. As I said, it's just from a couple years ago. It's a pretty recent study, done in a reasonably rigorous way, although of course there are always limitations with these kinds of studies. It's looking at the amount of effort and lines of code, that's kind of an ancillary thing, the amount of effort it takes to get an equivalent task done in different programming languages. And the survey included a lot of languages. Same tasks were done in a lot of languages, and people compared how much effort it took to get done in each of these languages. And let me get to here it is. So basically, as you would expect, machine language was by far the least efficient. It takes a lot of work to get anything done in a machine language. So after that, we see that assembly gets considerably more efficient than machine language. In this, lower numbers are better. This is work hours per function point. So that's nearly twice as efficient. Go down a bit further. C is more than twice as efficient as that is. Further down, we see JavaScript and Lisp, C++, Go, Java, PHP, Python, and Ruby a bit more productive than that. And then way down here, we see Elixir is actually another 15% more productive than Ruby, or it takes 15% fewer hours to get the same kind of task done. And Haskell and Julia and some other languages, OPA, came out about the same. And somewhat unsurprisingly, way down here, you see Excel is more than twice as fast at getting things done than any of those languages I just mentioned. And kind of makes sense. If there's a project that you can do with Excel reasonably, then you probably should. It'll probably be faster than if you use a full-blown programming language. Anyway, it's definitely worth checking out the paper if you haven't previously, and I hope that sheds some light on the situations where you might want to use Laravel or Phoenix. One thing I can say is if you know either of them, despite the fact that the languages are very different, there are a lot of similar patterns in the frameworks, and you probably won't have too hard of a time moving from one to the other if you have, quick crash course on the language syntax itself. That's it for this time. If you found this video useful, then subscribe and you will get more.